Okay, this is the podcast on death. Here goes. Let's talk about death. Did you just cringe when I said that? Why is it that the Western culture in general is afraid of death? Or worse, we pretend it doesn't exist, or we have that childish, I think it's childish anyway, perspective that it's not going to happen to me. Like I know it happens to others, but not me. There are many who would not even begin to listen to this podcast because of the title. Or who might start to turn it off right now if they've gotten this far. Yet death is all around us. It's part of life. And we all understand that intellectually. Many see death as a negative, as something dark, as something to be avoided at all costs. Personally, I've never felt this way, and I consider myself lucky because of that. Since I was a little girl, I never feared death for myself, nor did I shy away from it when it was around me. When someone was sick and dying, rather than staying away, for some reason I was drawn to it. Let me tell you a little bit about my first experiences with death. At age 16, I worked as a candy striper at a nursing home with my bestie Cheryl, which basically meant we went room to room and gave lemonade and cookies to the residents and chatted with them a bit. And we wore these cute little kind of nurse type, old school nurse, 1940s nursey outfits, except they were red and white striped. I loved this job. One of my favorite residents was Mr. Hornicle. I have no recollection of what we talked about, but I do remember how interesting he was and how small and frail and wrinkly he appeared. It was almost like he was one with the bed. Then one day, I went to work and his room was empty. Just like that, he had died. I was mildly surprised. Obviously, I was working in a nursing home, so I knew people were dying. But I didn't realize that you could be dying and still functioning at some capacity. It seemed like he was fine, and then he was dead. And that was my first personal experience with human death anyway. Since that job, I've worked at a nursing home as a caregiver in my 50s. I've been trained as a death doula. I do past life regressions, where I help people review their past lives and then bring them through the dying process of those past lives. And I do death rites for people who are dying or for those already deceased using the ways of the shaman. Now, I'm no expert, but I clearly do death. And I also work with spirits that have passed. So it helped that I had good experiences on this earth in this lifetime with death. My paternal grandmother, Grandma Schmidt, as we called her, and my maternal grandfather, Grandpa Hudson, died when I was in my early 20s. Grandma Schmidt had been in the hospital prior, so it wasn't a shock when she passed. I think it was heart disease. Grandma Schmidt was this round German woman who was very outgoing, very loud. I recall her in her house dress. That's kind of what they wore in those days when I was a little girl. Most grandmas did. And she'd sit in this big chair in their flat in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she'd bark orders at my tiny little grandfather. I'll talk about him later. And my sister and I, Coral, and I would go to the nearby Sherman Park with Grandma Schmidt, and we would sit in the bleachers while there was a baseball game being played. And you would have thought that it was my grandma's kids out there playing, because she would hoot and holler so loud, telling the players what to do and cheering them on. And I had never heard that before. Our house was kind of quiet, a little bit more quiet. And I just remember laughing and laughing. So she was always great fun. Grandpa Hodson died in more of a cliche way. You hear of this all the time. He and my other grandma, we'll talk about her later too, had been waiting patiently for him to retire from his factory job so they could travel the world, right? How many people do you know right now who are waiting for retirement so they can live their dream life? Or how many people do you know who waited for retirement so they could live their dream life, and then some health crisis hit? So 6 months after retirement and before any big trips were taken, he fell and broke his hip. And that was the beginning of the end. Grandpa Hodson, I remember as a guy who loved jokes. He loved women. He was always flirting with every woman. It didn't matter what age, anything. He was just all over the women. And he always drank Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, which is PBR these days, and a big hipster beer. So he was kind of cool before his time. But in the last months, my grandmother took care of him in their home, and he stayed in a hospital bed in the middle of the living room, so it wasn't a surprise either when he died. In my mid-30s, my other grandfather, Grandpa Schmidt, died. Grandpa Schmidt was this super interesting man, and maybe because I was older, I had a chance to get to know him a little more as an adult myself. But he was a yogi for as long as I knew, and I didn't realize until fairly recently how special and unique that was. He rode his bike all over the inner city of Milwaukee where he lived. He took me and my sister Coral on the bus when we visited, and we would go to what he would call the candy store. And I'm putting my little fingers up in air quotes when I say that. But it was really a health food store. And we got candy bars, more air quotes. But they were just made of carob and cashew. So he's very new agey. But that was just normal to me, right? That was just my grandpa. So Grandpa Schmidt was this small, concave kind of man, probably weighing about 110. And he was into all things healthy. My dad even grew up as a vegetarian. And Grandpa Schmidt had some funky exercise equipment in the attic where he lived. And he would hang from the rafters from this piece of equipment that would then straighten out your spine. And of course, my sister and I always hung ourselves like that by the neck. It was kind of fun. And he had this balance board. He'd sleep outside on his porch so that he could get fresh air. And he belonged to this spiritual organization called the Infinite Way. So, yeah, he was pretty cool dude. In the 70s, when running was all the rage, my dad put on an annual running race for the hospital that he worked at. And Grandpa Schmidt ran the 5K race and would win the 80-year-old plus trophy every time. I'm pretty sure he was the only 80-year-old running it. Grandpa Schmidt lived in the same house he was born in for the first 40 years of his life, and then he lived in that flat with my grandma in Milwaukee for the next 40 years. We eventually moved him into an assisted living place by the hospital my dad worked in, but he was still riding his bike when we moved him there, though after a while it was a three-wheeler because there were some balance challenges. And he would walk his neighbor's dog in the assisted living home. And that dog started out kind of a little chunky thing. It was a little dog. And because of all the exercise my grandpa gave it, he started living a very much skinnier dog life, and it was a lot healthier. But walking the dog and riding his bike hurt his body. He would share that myth with me and tell me it was hard for him to do. And I was young, so I would just say, well, why do you do it if it's hard and hurts your body? And he kind of explained from a 90-year-old perspective that if he stopped walking, and or stopped riding his bike, he would never be able to do those things for the rest of his life. So it was just such a different perspective. When Grandpa Schmidt was 94, he had a second stroke. So he had worked so hard to overcome the first one that when this one hit, he just decided that was enough. And all of his friends and family had been long deceased by then. And even his new younger friends that he would, meet would then die. So he was done. Like emotionally, he was done too. And he simply just stopped eating and drinking. And we just helped him stay comfortable. Since my parents and sister all worked in the medical field, they all knew exactly what was happening to him every step of the way as he started to die. So stage by stage, they would let me know what happens to the human body when you begin to die, how his body would get stiffer, how his organs were shutting down, and what that was going to look like. How his constant drowsiness was just normal because his body was busy at work of closing itself down. And because we knew he was dying, we had some time to inform friends and family. So anyone who wanted to come to say goodbye had a chance. My family also helped me understand when it was getting closer to his passing so that I could take off of work. And that was very practical and helpful. So when he was laying in the hospital bed, no longer eating and drinking, we would swab his mouth with a Q-tip that was dipped in apple juice so that it would just, give him some kind of taste and his mouth would stay moist. And we just stayed by his side. And one night, when no one was in the room, was the night he decided to pass away. And yes, in my belief system, that is how it can work. Particularly when you're holding a vigil like we were, and then on the odd night when he was alone, that's the night he passed. I see that as a choice on his part, for whatever reason he may have had. So these deaths of those grandparents didn't cause turmoil for me, other than knowing that I would miss them. I wasn't afraid of their deaths. I wasn't repelled by how frail they each got and how their looks and abilities changed. I was curious, but never turned off by it. When my last grandmother died, I was in my 40s, Grandma Hotson, as I called her growing up. When my daughter came along, Grandma Hotson changed her name to Nani because my daughter Jamie was her first great-granddaughter, and my grandma was not about to be called a great-grandma, so she picked a different name, and she picked Nani. So Nani was the clear matriarch of our family. She was a strong and influential woman in a very quiet and kind way. She loved to have our family around her and was always cooking and baking for us. She was a seamstress, and she sewed many of our clothes as I grew up. She owned her own business, which was extremely unusual in those days. I come from a long line of badass women who were remarkable, and some of them extremely successful. Nani's sister was a self-made millionaire. Nani had a small beauty salon in her basement, so she wasn't making big bucks or anything, but it was still pretty badass in my mind. She wore jean skirts and bikinis, while many of the other grandmothers would wear those house dresses, and they'd have their hair in curlers, but Nani wasn't anything like that. She was like a super hip grandma, and she was my savior in a lot of ways. She and I were extremely close. She was definitely a soulmate for me. She is definitely a soulmate for me. And when she had her heart attack, April 1st, 2005, I remember that date specifically, I knew it would be a slippery slope from there. She was in her mid-80s. And for example, as the owner of a beauty salon, you can imagine that her hair and ours was always looking good. Yet after her heart attack, she stopped coloring her hair. She started giving away her jewelry. She cleaned out all her closets and drawers. So all of those were clear signs to me that she was planning an exit. Every Wednesday after her heart attack, I would drive 90 minutes south to see her. And I recall in the wee hours of one particular Wednesday when I couldn't sleep, it was in the night and I couldn't sleep. And rather than just lay there awake in bed, I decided to just get dressed and head down extra early to see her. She was in the hospital again, which is also common for people who are in the dying stage of life. So I went straight to the hospital and was there around 6 a.m. And I quietly walked into her room so I wouldn't wake her. But she was wide awake. And she looked at me as I walked in and she kind of waved me over and said, "Wendy, I'm so glad to see you. I was just having a conversation with your grandfather." Now let's remember he was dead, right, by then. So she said that he came to me in that corner of the room, and she would point to the empty corner in the ceiling of the hospital room. And she'd say, "He was trying to convince me to come and join him, but I just kept telling him, I'm not dying today." And she didn't. And that just became a little funny joke between us. I'm not dying today. So we still kind of say that in our family. Just before Thanksgiving, I brought my kids, Jamie and Jordan, down to see her. And at this point, she was back in her townhouse. So she had them help her out like she often did. They cleaned some leaves off her porch. And we just had such a nice time with her. And she'd been struggling to keep her home up and had spent some time living with my aunt and uncle at their home. But by this point, she was doing okay. She was caring for herself. It took all of her energy to do that, but, she was doing okay. And at the end of that visit, rather than me thinking that she was on the upswing based on all of the facts and evidence all around me, I knew as I hugged her goodbye that that would be the last time I saw her alive. As an intuitive and an empath, I sometimes know these things. And she did too. So we both had this unique look in our eye as we embraced for our last goodbye. I had the kids both give her a big hug too, right? And as I drove away, I remember encouraging my cousin to go see her before she passed and told her that I was pretty sure she was going to die soon. And she did. A few days later, Nani passed. But what happened when she passed was very interesting to me. Rather than me feeling like she was 90 minutes south in a different town, the way I thought about her like when she was alive, I felt all of a sudden as if she was with me after she passed. And it was almost better than when she lived in her human body because I felt her all the time. Her spirit was with me. Her spirit is with me 24/7. It's very comforting. And now I just talk to her anytime I want versus having to call her or having to visit. So I feel her presence often in my life. And I wasn't heavy into the spiritual beliefs that I have now at that point. But I just recall thinking how interesting that was, that instead of her being in a physical place, she's now everywhere around me. And that feels good. So why am I sharing all these death stories? It's my lead-in. Okay, it's a very long lead-in. Because as I said, I wanted to talk about death today. And I'm comfortable with death. And our family's comfortable with death. Well, comfortable with it happening, I think. But we still didn't really talk about it. My mother, Sheila, passed away when I was in my 40s. It was suicide. Nani was still alive at that point. Sheila was borderline personality disorder and had tried on several occasions to commit suicide as I was growing up. She really didn't like living. She struggled. So when she finally succeeded, it was a shock, but it wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew her. So that death, of course, was a bit different. And Sheila had never really been like a mother to me, so I wasn't attached to her like that. So for me, the emotions were not strong at all with her passing. Because Sheila's death was abrupt, and she was pretty young, she was 59, it was more shocking than losing my grandparents was. And though she had been sick with mental illness, because it wasn't something visible and kind of like an external physical deterioration, other people looked at her death differently. I didn't, but others around me seemed to. And frankly, from a feeling standpoint, her death was a relief to me. She was a challenge for me in my life, as you can imagine, growing up with a caregiver who couldn't care for you. So when she passed, it wasn't for me like many of you are thinking about losing your own mother. She didn't play a mother role for me at all. So it wasn't like that. Nani's death was more like losing a mother for me. So all of this sharing about my grandparents and Sheila's deaths is just to give you a backdrop about my personal experience with death. Which makes me think, like, what's your personal experience, right? That likely has set the tone for you in many ways of how you think and feel about death. And how your family reacts to death also has an impact. And then, later in life, I got into past life regressions. So if you've listened to any of my first podcasts, maybe you've had a past life experience by now. If you haven't, you might want to give that a try. But if you believe in past lives, then a past life regression is a process where I put you in a trance and help you remember one of your past lives. If you don't believe in that sort of thing, then it can be looked at as a conversation with your subconscious. But either way, it's very, very healing for most people. And providing past life experience for hundreds of people by now has meant I've experienced hundreds of more deaths, because during each past life experience, I bring people all the way through the death of that past life. So I find out, where they were, what was happening, how they felt, who was with them. And it's continued to make me more and more comfortable with death. So much so that a few months ago, I attended and completed a training course to become a death doula. First off, I had no idea there were even death doulas, that was even a role. The formal role is kind of a new thing. That's why I hadn't heard of it. But of course, people have been helping other people die since the beginning of humanity. Hospice and hospitals do some of this work, but nurses and doctors and hospice tend to have more of a medical focus. Death doulas are there to help the individual and their family from more of an emotional bent. Did you know that about 80% of us will know that we're dying when it happens? Those tragic, quick deaths only happen about 20% of the time. The rest of us tend to get sick, usually from cancer, liver failure, or Alzheimer's. Those are the biggest right now in our society. Some of us are lucky enough to die of old age. But those deaths are a longer process. And as it's happening, it's a slow deterioration. Death doulas can help the dying do maybe like a legacy project if they want to. Maybe they want to write letters to their grandkids or their future great-grandkids. Or maybe they want to do a picture album or whatever speaks to them to mark their life in some way. Death doulas also help the dying think through how they want to die. For those of you who don't like to think about death, you may be so afraid of it that instead of planning it out, you may just want to fight death tooth and nail to the very end. And that might be just perfect for you. Would it be helpful to know that most likely you'll spend your last months and weeks being rushed to the emergency rooms with hospital stays and eventually die probably pretty drugged out with a lot of tubes coming out of your body in a hospital room? Maybe even still recovering from a recent surgery, if that's kind of your non-plan, if you don't think it through. For many of you, you do want that. So I am not knocking it at all. I guess what I want for you is to at least think about it and decide and know that is the death I want. But others may instead want to be more conscious before they die. Depending on what you're dying from, there may be a continuum between the level of pain you want to tolerate and the level of consciousness you prefer. And for each of us, we might lean one way or the other on that continuum. And it also might change over time. Do you want to know as much as you can about the dying process, or do you want to know very little? Do you want your loved ones informed so that they can be with you or reach out? Maybe you want your last days and moments to be surrounded by love in your own home, maybe listening to some meaningful music you've selected, maybe with candles burning or certain scents. Maybe you want to be out in nature. I know of one friend who plans to just go out walking in the wilderness, hoping that a mountain lion devours him in the end. So maybe you want to have your friends come in one by one and tell you what they loved about their connection with you. Who knows? But the point is death doulas can help the dying plan out their death process so they die the way they want to. And even if you don't choose to include a death doula, you now know that there are options. And it might be important for you to think about those and to make a plan. Death doulas also help the families. Often the loved ones are more frightened than the dying. There are common patterns that happen when someone is actively dying. And the active dying process means that your body has actually started to shut down in a fairly consistent pattern, and the death is happening. They are definitely starting their transition. And you can't stop death from happening or save them or turn it around once a human body is in the active dying stage. So what happens during that active dying stage? Seeing people who have already crossed over is common for a person dying, like Nani seeing Grandpa Hodson in the corner of her hospital room. How they hold their bodies and different body parts like their mouth and their hands and the color of their skin, all of these things change in the last days and moments, which can be scary for family members who haven't seen the dying process before, unless they know it's completely normal, and that often helps people. Hearing that labored breathing, often called the death rattle, can also be alarming to family members until they understand that it's likely not causing any pain or problems for the dying. It just sounds weird. The family can learn techniques to alleviate that sound also if they want. And the religious beliefs of the dying can also be a critical element to all of this. There are many religions that have specific rituals for the dying. If you're working with death doulas, they check their own belief systems at the door, and they are just there to support the dying and their families and any of their customs and traditions and religious beliefs and rituals. Talking to a dying person who's getting ready to die and listening to what they're talking about and what they share can feel like sort of an abandonment to some family members. They might feel that the dying person is giving up before they need to. Or the family may be more focused on themselves than the dying person and overwhelmed with what happens next for them. And again, death doulas can be there to help counsel during all of that. And they can help both the dying person and the family members say things that need to be said, forgive or ask for forgiveness for things done. They can be the conduit between those types of conversations. And even just having them around, they might be able to sense or feel that someone has something to say before their loved one passes, and they just maybe don't know how to get it out. So I'm not trying to do some big commercial for death doulas here, though I think they're amazing, but I am trying to show you and unveil that death doesn't have to be dark and depressing and sad. It can actually be a beautiful part of these lives of ours. And it's a very unique, special time of life where things can happen. It's the only time certain things can happen. For many who die, Death is not a negative experience or a process. Yes, there may be inner turmoil at first about leaving this world or things left undone, but the actual process can be pretty pain-free for most and can frankly be a beautiful passage and transition to what's next. Did you know that a lot of people wash the body of the deceased after they passed? Would you want that for yourself? And if you do, who would you want to have that honor? And would you want to do that for a loved one? And don't you just think it would be nice to talk about? So yeah, it's an entire element of life that many of us don't talk about, we don't think about, and therefore we don't plan. And wouldn't you want to instead think about how you'd want to die and who you would want to be there? And then, what happens next, right? After someone passes, the grieving process is another beast to tackle. Everyone handles grief differently. And everyone, first of all, they felt differently about the newly deceased. So the process can look a million different ways for the people experiencing that death of that loved one. And the grieving can last different lengths of time and just come out in different ways. And beyond the emotional pieces, there's practical elements to death as well. I have a death pack that I've had ready and waiting for my kids should I die suddenly. It's this packet on my desk of material, and it's practical information like the name and contact for my attorney and accountant, what I own, where my money is, what I owe. But it's also information about my wishes regarding how my body is disposed of. For me, if I die suddenly, please use every single organ you possibly can and anything else. Cut my body up and disperse me to as many other people as you can so that they can continue living their lives, right? And then whatever is left, I would like a green burial. And if the local laws allow it, I would like to be buried under a very specific tree I call the grandmother Bodhi tree on my property here at Cahya Center. Or maybe at Kayak, Hawaii at that point. All of those wishes are in my death pack, along with letters to my kids. And because I've had this pack sitting on this very specific spot on my desk for years and years, by now I've written several letters to the kids. I just keep writing updated letters every 3 to 4 years or so. And I keep the old ones for them so that they can just see them all. Why should I have destroyed them? Right? They'll see how my messages to them have shifted over the years. And of course, there's the other practical stuff, like ensuring you have a will or a trust. And do you even know the difference between a will and a trust? And do you know which one might be better for you and your situation? I've got my trust solid and regularly updated. I am ready to go at any minute, frankly. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you today in this podcast. Talk about death. Don't pretend it's not going to happen. Make it normal to talk about things. And then that brings up another big reason and another aspect about living your life in a way that you're kind of ready for death. No regrets. Dump things you don't like in your life. You hate your job? Get another one. Unhappy? Fix it. Heal from it. Push on. Reading books like the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying and the Tibetan Book of the Dead can help keep your perspective in life so you can live this life as you want to its fullest, with nearly zero fear of what happens and what comes next. I can tell you that's how I live my life most of the time, and it is pretty awesome. It's pretty fun. It's pretty chill. It's pretty amazing. If you get yourself into a situation where you kind of think, maybe I'm going to die right now because it's kind of scary. I'm like super chill about it. I don't panic. I'm not nervous and tense about it. So how might you live your life differently? Like, let's say you knew you were going to die specifically in 5 years from now. How would you live these next 5 years differently? How about 2 years? What if you knew you had 2 years? How about 1 year? And what if somebody told you you have 3 months to live? Right? I think those are good things to ponder and consider. So I hope I got you thinking today and feeling, and maybe healing as well. Namaste.